So, welcome everyone to today's topic of conversation. I just wanted to start today with a quick question for you. Have you ever spoken to someone? Have you ever had a conversation where it seems like no matter how clear you think you're being, that other person just doesn't seem to quite understand what you're trying to say? It seems like, especially in text form or any of those other ways that are not in person, as much as you try to explain, that other person just seems to be taking exactly what you're saying and just kind of either twisting it, or it seems like you're saying something completely different. Well, there's a reason for that. And that's because we take in information, especially when we're not face to face, in a very different way because it depends on how I'm feeling, depends on my mood, and depends if I'm hungry or sad, lonely, afraid, angry, whichever way that I am feeling, it's going to affect whatever I read, which is why you have a lot of people that read something on the internet and they completely misunderstand what is meant. We're human. We are flawed. We tend to misinterpret or sometimes even just miss completely what the other person is saying. There's a solution to that. And the solution, I mean, generally speaking, is to be in the presence of somebody when you're having that in-depth conversation and being as at peace as you can. What that means is if you're hungry and you're starting to get hangry by that point, whatever your conversation was going to be, especially if it's going to be a tough conversation with somebody you love, it's going to turn into possibly a fight because you are not yourself. So if you're rested, if you've eaten, if you've gotten your basic needs met, then that conversation can grow or flow a little easier. Why do I point this out today? Because, well, for starters, in the gospel today, we hear that Jesus instructs us and says, when you go to prayer, do not babble like the Pharisees do. Do not, go on and on. And it seems like I do that all the time when I have these talks. But he makes it clear that we shouldn't do those things, that at the core of it, God already knows what we need before we even ask him. Now, then most people would say, okay, so I'm just not going to tell God anything. And of course, that's not the point. When Jesus reminds us of that, or when Jesus tells us that, is not to just forego all conversation with God. It just basically instructs us that you don't have to explain to God why you need that thing. For example, let's say your prayer is for someone that you love. You want them to get healed, and it's not necessary to make a deal with God and say, well, if you make this miracle happen, then I will do X, Y, or Z thing. But on the other hand, it also forces us to step outside of ourselves when in that conversation with God. Jesus gives us those instructions in a certain way. He gives us, when you go to prayer, this is how you are supposed to pray. And then he gives us the Our Father. So that wasn't saying like any kind of writ prayer is meaningless. The problem is when our hearts are not in that prayer. When I just, whether it's the rosary, whether it's any kind of other prayer, if my heart is not in it, then that's when Jesus tells us. Now, obviously, your heart's not always going to be in it in prayer. I mean, sometimes you're going to come to pray the Mass and you're not going to want to be there, but invite Jesus, invite God into those moments when you don't, quote unquote, feel like praying. And then that prayer becomes more honest. Going back to the conversation you have with someone, I bet you that that's the way God feels with us sometimes. He answers every single prayer. I can guarantee you that. He answers every single prayer, but here's the thing. He doesn't do it on our time. He doesn't do it the way we always wanted to answer because he knows what we need again before we even ask. He knows what could help us in our salvation before we even ask. What that leaves us with is a one sided conversation. It leaves us feeling like God isn't listening. And in a really humanistic way, it leaves God feeling like he's not listened to because we either because we're afraid of the answer or because we just don't want to follow his will, we end up just uh, acting like we're deaf to his word, his command. How many men out there have decided not to follow God's call to the priesthood? It's not that we have an absence of vocations, it's just that we have fewer and fewer men willing to answer that vocation. So, just to kind of leave you with this, when you go to pray, when you go to have a conversation with someone, it's important not only to speak, obviously, because then a conversation becomes one-sided if you don't speak or if the other person doesn't speak. But the most important part of that is after you speak, you stop, wait, and listen. If you don't stop, wait, and listen, it becomes a monologue. It's just you talking. And the way I kind of feel like this is sometimes, it's just a monologue. Right now, all you hear is Marcos, and all I hear is Marcos. But prayer should be a conversation. I mean, at its core, at its heart, I know I've touched on this before. A prayer should be conversation, but ultimately, that's when you're going to feel the most fulfilled in your prayer life. When you see it as a conversation from your heart to God. If that isn't becoming a conversation, then I would recommend trying different things out, trying other ways of communicating. Again, to take it in a humanistic perspective, if communicating by text isn't working, then we actually have to sit there and call someone. If that's not working, then we have to set up a meeting and meet with this person. It's the same with God. He gives us, especially for us Catholics, we have so many ways to pray that we don't have to focus on just one way and one way only. Especially when it comes to the Mass, it's the most perfect way to pray. And again, that's the beautiful thing about our actual Mass is it becomes a call and response. It becomes something that you do not just with your words but with your actions. Your facial expression should be an example of whatever your spirit is feeling at the moment and what your actions are at Mass. And if they're not really connecting, then it means that you maybe have to try something different. Not to say that you shouldn't go to Mass, of course, but to take it a step further and actually do something different. Because ultimately, that's what it is at Mass. At Mass, you are face to face with our Creator. You are face to face with Jesus, our Redeemer. You are face to face with the Holy Spirit, our Paraclete. And that's the best way to communicate. I mean, if you look at the instances of people fighting on the internet, people fighting via text and all that, and then you get them face to face. I mean, a lot of the times you still fight, but a lot of the times you have a decent conversation with that person because you're fighting or you're conversing with somebody in person. So I'll leave you with that. I invite you into a deeper prayer. And if you do anything else today, I would at least invite you to take 5 minutes and pray the Our Father, but don't just pray it Our Father, because that's not even going to take a single minute. But I would suggest you pray the Our Father and you meditate on what those words mean, what it actually is to say Our Father, and take every section of the Our Father and really delve into it and just see what God has in store for you during that prayer. I can guarantee you it's something special and something beautiful and something specific for you. So thanks so much for listening. Marcos out.